Welcome to the July 2019 SCR Connections webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers, Dr. Kris Chesky and Dr. Sajid Surve. They are the co-directors of the UNT Texas Center for Performing Arts Health, which is at the forefront of research, education, and clinical care for the medical problems of performing artists for the past 20 years. The Texas Center for Performing Arts Health is home to the world's first PhD in music with a concentration in performing arts. Without further ado, I'm going to let them take over.
Good morning, everybody. This is Sajid Surve talking. And we're going to talk this morning about performing arts health. And we're going to frame it in the context of a tale of two needs. So when we look at performing arts health, we think about it in terms of the needs of the performing arts community, and we think about it in terms of the needs of the medical community. And so both of these communities need information about one another. And so there's going to be a strong role for informatics, which we'll talk about in a moment. But we also want to take some time to just kind of recap the history of how we got to this point and how performing arts health has become a topic that is really gaining a lot of traction, not just at the local level, but at the national and international level. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the medical community. And in order to understand this, I think the most instructive example that we can use is lessons from sports medicine. So we're at UNT. This is the Mean Green Sports Medicine team here working on the athletes in the training room. And sports medicine has had a really long history to become what it is today. And so I just wanted to touch briefly upon the history of sports medicine with the understanding that we're going to draw some parallels in a moment. So when we look at the timeline of sports medicine, it really begins back in the 1950s and extends all the way up to really the 1990s in terms of establishing sports medicine as a field that is important and a field that warrants attention and dollars to be able to look at this population of athletics and understand the problems that athletes face. Sports medicine as a concept really began in the year 1954. At the time, there was a group called I'm paraphrasing, but the American Association of Health Education and Recreation, something along those lines. And within that, there were a group of people who were looking at sports and physicians who were looking at sports, and they had a subgroup, a study group within that larger organization. And in 1954, they held a meeting which they branded the American Federation of Sports Medicine, which was part of that larger conference. So it began with a meeting of people who were doing this type of work. After these folks met and started doing this type of work, what they decided was that, if we want to push this agenda forward of sports medicine as a concept, we need to meet more regularly. So the very next year, they started a symposium on sports medicine where people who were doing this type of work were able to get together and talk about the field of sports medicine and network with one another and try to form a community of people who do this type of work. And what quickly came out of those discussions was the idea that if we're going to be serious about this type of work, we need to be scholarly in what we do. And so in 1962, they formed a journal, the Journal of Sports Medicine and Physical Fitness, which was founded. And this was now a space where sports science, the idea of research-based approaches, had a home where you could publish studies that you were doing on sports medicine and physical fitness. And so from this, as you started to develop more evidence on the concepts of sports medicine, injury prevention, proper hydration, concepts like rests and breaks and managing the task of exercise, as we were able to develop a stronger evidence base, we came to realize that in the sports world that we needed to start making some changes to public policy, that the way the public is handling these ideas of sports and fitness were not necessarily ideal. And so about 10 years later, after 10 years of evidence had accumulated, they decided the sports medicine world convened a workshop, first ever workshop on quality control and exercise. And the goal of this was to try to develop best practices on exercise. What should we be doing? How should we exercise? What's the most optimal way to do this and not get injured in the process? As a result of that, the ACSM published national guidelines on exercise, saying this is what we believe, based on these years of evidence that are available, this is what we believe is the best practice in terms of exercise. And these were quickly adopted by the federal government and pushed out into the schools, and not just high school, at the collegiate level, to say these are what the guidelines should be. And that process has continued to this day, where the ACSM continues to refine and change these guidelines, and they immediately get adopted as federal policy and pushed out into the school level. Once this started to happen and we started to see that public policy is now changing, right? What this does is it creates a demand, because these mandates are there. We need to follow these guidelines, but the community isn't sure what to do about this. And so as a result of that, we started to realize we need specific training on how to make clinicians able to handle this population. So in 1985, 10 years later, the Cleveland Clinic opened the first sports medicine fellowship. So this is a fellowship that physicians could take to specialize in this new field of sports medicine. The governing body extended from that, because not everybody can do a fellowship. There's only 1 or 2 fellows per year. And so the ACSM then launched a team physician training course a couple years later to allow for any clinician who wants to learn more about how to be a team physician can get this training and get this certification, and then go on to become a team physician for a sporting group, either at the high school level or collegiate level or even the professional level. And so, and then as that started to happen, now you have this body of physicians, and after this fellowship opened in 1985, shortly thereafter, several other fellowships began to open, to the point where there was a few dozen fellowships in existence by the early 1990s, all pumping out new physicians who have this credentialing in sports medicine. And so eventually the time came where it led to the creation of a board, or a board exam. So there was a certificate of additional qualification, which is in sports medicine, was created in 1993. And so now this is a national certification that physicians can get, which certify them in this field of sports medicine, and it qualifies them to understand all the basic underpinnings of sport, the concepts of injury prevention, how to manage injuries within this population, how to prevent injuries within the sports population. And what we've seen from 1993 onwards, now in 2019, the whole notion of the sports medicine physician is second nature, right? So once you've had 25 plus years of these sports medicine physicians being around, it seems obvious that an athlete would need a physician who's qualified to be able to handle their specific injuries, to the point where now, if you're a collegiate sporting program, through the license or accredited through the NCAA, you can't have a Division I sports program unless you have a sports medicine physician as part of your team. You have a training room, you have an athletic trainer, you follow certain rules and regulations. And so at the collegiate level, changes have been made to institutionalize these positions and these roles, to say that the athlete can't do it alone. They need a team of people around them to support and maintain that team, to allow them to do their task in a way that's going to be working the best and preventing injury, and allowing these athletes to work in a way that's as healthy as possible. So just to recap, it started with a meeting, which led to a symposium, which led to a journal founding, which led to changes in public policy, recommendations for change to public policy. Once the public policy came about, then the training program started, and then the training programs gave way to board certification, and then the board certification, and really the culmination of all this is the normalization of sports medicine, right? The idea in the public view that sports medicine is a field that is worthy of study and understanding. So now we're going to kind of take a parallel look at performing arts medicine, right? So the idea of health in performing artists. As you see, the timeline starts about 30 years in the future, right, from sports medicine, so there's about a 30-year lag from the notion of sports medicine to the notion of performing arts medicine. But the events are largely the same. So it began in 1983. There was a symposium on performing arts medicine, so people who were doing this type of work came together, said, hey, you're working on musicians, I'm working on musicians too. You're working on dancers, I'm working on dancers too. Hey, maybe we should get together and start to network a little bit and understand one another. So this first ever symposium happened in Aspen, Colorado, in association with the Aspen Jazz Festival. And out of this, we realized that there needed to be a journal. So the Medical Problems of Performing Artists Journal was founded in 1986. And again, saying if we're going to look at this work, we need to do it in a way that's scholarly. And so a home was created for people to do this type of research and be able to publish that research and build a body of knowledge. We were founded in 1999, so a little bit of time elapsed where this journal is publishing. Now the symposiums are continuing yearly, right? So there's a yearly symposium. There's the journal being published. Our center was formed in 1999 as the Texas Center for Music and Medicine. A few years back, we renamed ourselves to the Texas Center for Performing Arts Health to be more inclusive of all forms of performing arts, not just music. But as a result of all of this work and this body of knowledge getting put together, the realization was that we need to have some influence on public policy. And so performing arts medicine is talking about the physician, the clinician, right, the one providing care to the performing artist. But the realization was there that if we want to influence performing arts, really what we need to do is influence the artists where they are and talk about the health educator, the music educators, the dance educators, and specifically in this case, the music educators. And how do we change policy and change the guidelines to empower these educators to be able to provide instruction to these new music students in a way that is going to promote, health and break down some of the stigmas that are there around health. And again, all of these stigmas were present for the athletes as well, but it was a concerted effort to take steps to break down this stigmatization. So our center, the Texas Center for Music and Medicine at the time, hosted this conference called the Health Promotion in Schools of Music Conference, and the idea with that was to bring 21 different national organizations together to talk about what constitutes health promotion, should schools be health promoting institutions, and to come up with some recommendations for best practices on performing music. Out of that, in the, just got to go forward here, in the MPPA, Medical Problems of Performing Artists Journal, the HSPM proceedings were published, as well as recommendations on what best practices would be to turn music into a health promoting organization. And over a course of time, in 2011, the National Association of Schools of Music adopted those guidelines and said that now at the collegiate level, all college music programs, tertiary education groups, need to provide specific instruction to their students about the risks of performing music, best practices in terms of mental health, physical health, hearing health, vocal health, and try to understand these concepts. Right around the same time, the sports world and the performing arts world collided a little bit. So the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, founded this initiative called Athletes in the Arts with the idea that the sports medicine world has some experience in this arena of trying to promote health within a specific population. That organization is still around today, and they continue to try to build they're trying to change the culture and create resources for performing artists and clinicians as well. And so just like the sports world, once we have this body of evidence, we change these national guidelines, we start promoting health within the performing arts population, the community realizes we need to start training physicians and training people on how to do this type of work. So in combination, PAMA, which is the Performing Arts Medicine Association, and the ACSM partnered together to create a training certificate that clinicians could take, and others too, but clinicians can take. It's a 2-day certification course that clinicians can take to learn about the basic principles of what are performing arts, what are the basic concepts of injury prevention, what are the concepts of mental health and vocal health. And so this has been, very recent. And then in 2019, so just this year, our center, the Texas Center for Performing Arts Health, launched a fellowship in performing arts medicine for physicians to be able to get an additional year of training. And so ours is the first, but we expect that more will follow in the upcoming years. And so we are, where we are right now as a performing arts community is essentially where the sports medicine community was in the 1990s, right, in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, where we're starting to see these training programs emerge. We're starting to see this need for evidence and best practices, and we have the benefit of having a group like the sports medicine folks who've already fought this battle to be able to provide a little bit of insight in terms of their athletes in the arts, with this premise that artists are like athletes, and in some cases that is true. They have some similar demands in terms of, rigorous practice schedules. They have spend a lot of time honing their craft. They have time constraints in terms of their ability to perform and have to perform at a moment's notice, and oftentimes don't have a lot of time for rest and recovery. So there are a lot of parallels there that you can draw between the athletic community and the performing arts community. I was invited to submit a contribution to Maryland Medicine for this special edition that they released on humanities in medicine. And so I wrote this piece called Performing Arts Medicine, an underserved population with unique demands. Part of this article was to kind of draw that contrast and talk about, athletes are like performing artists. And so we spent a period of time talking about that. But we also talked about the fact that there are some notable differences between performing artists and athletes. They're not the same. There's distinct differences between the two. And coming out of this work, one of the phrases from this is, just answering these kinds of questions. How do injuries happen? Who gets injured and why? How can we prevent it? The performing arts literature is really only at the preliminary phases of answering these very basic questions about the performing artist. So we still have a lot of time to go. Remember, sports has a 30-year head start in some ways on the development of a body of knowledge and literature and understanding this population. So we have decades to go to catch up with that infrastructure, and because of that, the performing arts community, has some fewer resources available in terms of being able to understand what constitutes best practices and how do we disseminate this information as best we can. And so with that in mind, there's a strong role for informatics here, right? So what evidence-based guidelines we do have, and there are some, we need to be able to, find these evidence-based resources for the clinician, and I would also add for the performing artists themselves, right? Try to collect these evidence-based resources and be able to disseminate not just the evidence-based resources, but also the best practices in terms of what's out there, to give that to the community. I think the informatics community has a role to play in terms of partnering with performing arts medicine organizations, groups like Texas Center for Performing Arts Health, groups like Athletes in the Arts, groups like the Performing Arts Medicine Association, groups that are out there to, be able to partner with informatics groups to, again, accomplish these other goals. And we've started to do some of that already, partnering with the NMLM South Central region to publish a primer on musician health, which we can talk about later on in the question section if you have interest in that. And then also, I think the informatics world can serve as a space to facilitate communication between performers and clinicians. I think there's an opportunity here to start continuing this discussion on how these two groups can interface with one another and work together. And so that's a big picture view of what the timeline and history of how performing arts medicine has evolved over time. And we've brought you to somewhat the current state of performing arts health. But to dive a little bit deeper into that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Chesky, to talk a little bit more about, where we go from the future and what's happening and what's new on the horizon. So, Dr. Chesky, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Surve. Thank you for inviting me today. Brian, I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to disseminate some information regarding the health and well-being of performing artists. I have a different tact that I'm going to try to take here where instead of, oops, I'll follow you. Okay, back up here. Yeah. So when Dr. Surve mentioned one of the seminal events in our history of performing arts health, he mentioned the Health Promotion in Schools and Music Project. In 2004, UNT hosted this national event. We had about 150 people, 21 national organizations, and very rich dialogue as to what should a school of music do to prepare a musician and to service the music students along these areas of health concerns. And during that time, there were basically three perspectives that emerged within this population of delegates and professionals across a wide spectrum of disciplines. And these three groups, from my point of view, sort of represented those people who thought that the music school, the School of Music, would be best served by having resources available to the students for in order to respond to a potential problem. So in the sports world, you might have a sports medicine or athletic trainer off on the sideline, so if something happens to the athlete, either during training or during game, there were some resources there to help facilitate care. And so the 650 accredited music schools might consider having these kinds of resources available to the music student population. The second group was kind of arguing for wellness programs to facilitate the development of a robust persona, robust psychology, robust physiology that would help a student be better prepared to meet the demands of making music. So people were advocating for things like nutrition guidance, things that you would see in a wellness center like yoga classes or Pilates or meditation resources, things like this, to help facilitate the robustness of the performing artist, even weight training and exercise programs that would make somebody more suitable and ready to meet the demands of music. The third group, which I think is the most interesting, and I was probably the foremost advocate of this point of view, was to consider how does a musician get injured? What factors contribute to the evolution of a problem? And when we think about that point of view, we call into play the actual activity of music making. And in an educational context, the pedagogy of learning how to make music at a professional level. And to me, based on our research and my observations over these many years, is that that is where most of the action should take place because music is a verb, it's a behavior, and depending upon how we act musically, we set ourselves up for greater or lesser risk. And of course, then, taking off from that point of view, who is implicated in evolving that sort of an agenda? Well, it's the actual people doing music, teaching music, providing instruction to young musicians. So the challenges associated with that view can be considered similarly to the sports medicine thing. So at some point in sports history, sports medicine history, a couple branches from the tree of knowledge decided to collaborate. So we had medicine and sports, and a new branch emerged, sports medicine, sports science, sports psychology. And we want to have the same kind of thing happen within the music and the performing arts arenas. So historically, the music discipline has had very little to do with medicine or psychology. And So from that point of view, I want to kind of now work backwards a little bit, as Dr. Surve kind of provided a historical insight into how we got to where we are today. Well, I'm going to go backwards and actually look at some things that are going on as recently as yesterday. So this picture here is a photograph of people who work in the independent school district in Denton, Texas, where the University of North Texas main campus is and the College of Music campus is. And these are fine arts professionals who teach choir, band, and orchestra, and they're attending a series of workshops this summer to, I guess, transform their independent school district into one that has fine arts programs that includes teachers who are aware of these problems and thinking about how do I prepare a young musician to adopt an attitude and a set of practices that are most likely to prevent the potential for injuries, while at the same time thinking about how do we engage a student in an ensemble-based instructional activity in ways that mitigate risk. So from the choir director behind the baton is giving instruction to teachers, to students that would increase awareness, knowledge, and self-competency to manage the musical behaviors that are eventually risk-averse. And by the way, this is a project that was funded by the NNLM very recently to help us move in this direction. So Denton ISD has decided to partner with our center and become sort of the tip of the spear for a Texas-wide transformation of our identity as music educators. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring up that happened this last year was the development of the first ever PhD program in music. So if we want to address these issues as a consequence of how we do music, how we train musicians, then we need people in the music discipline that are suitable or prepared to do this kind of research. So we proposed and were approved to have a PhD in music where the primary emphasis is on performing arts health. And just last week, we were at UCLA at the Performing Arts Medicine International Symposium for the first time with some of these PhD students. And I got a couple of slides here just to give you an idea of what this type of discipline's contributions to our understanding of these risks can include. So here we have myself and two doctoral students. The one on the left is a DMA student, doctoral musical arts student in saxophone, and the one in the middle is one of our new PhD students. And their research poster is quantifying the extent that saxophonists have certain types of health problems. What's interesting about this poster is that it took the saxophonist to bring to the agenda a certain perspective that was prior to this particular research just totally ignored or unknown. So we think about musculoskeletal injuries among saxophonists, and we ask about where does it hurt, where do you get injured. Previous research neglected to understand that the inside of the lower lip is the primary area of concern. So we have the musician scholar now adding very, very critical insights into what's important to the musician and being prepared to do this kind of research and also to advance science. So this particular project will get published soon. Here's another one where two students are looking at the performance anxiety literature. And this particular poster provides a really interesting insight into even what performance anxiety is and how it manifests itself in musician populations. This study looked at 84 publications over the last 40 years about performance anxiety and analyzed who authored the paper. Come to find out, half of them came from the music discipline, half of them came from the allied health disciplines, and they have very, very significantly different orientations to this problem, showcasing the need to have interdisciplinarity and to consider what the musician or the performing arts communities consider important. And in this particular, did you advance that? Go back, I just want to make one more point. And what's so interesting about performance anxiety, which is not accounted for so much in the health literature, is that it's actually considered to be a potentially facilitative aspect or factor that musicians or music teachers understand. So in other words, in order to get high-level performance gains, we have to stress the student. We have to create a sense of anxiety. And depending upon how we do that, the student can actually benefit from that. And now that we are looking at that sort of beneficial aspect of performance anxiety, we have a better understanding of how it should be considered as part of the instructional activities, even down into middle school ensemble-based activities. Here's another one. This is a student from Korea who's a violist working on his doctorate, failed his first doctoral recital due to hyperhidrosis. So here's a genetic condition that causes excessive sweating in his hands. He didn't know what to do about it. There's very little literature at all about this condition among musicians. Not only did he do research to find out he's not alone, but he's also been investigating ionophoresis as a method to reduce the sweating, which is successful for him and now enabling him to play. So again, we have the musician point of view brought to the forefront, and musician scholars starting to do research to evaluate the extent and the potential solutions. Here's another student. Actually, this Sarah Dunbar won an award for this research poster. And here is a perfect example of the integration of disciplines. She worked in the cadaver lab here for several months, mapping out facial muscles locations in order to measure the muscle activity involved with playing multiple woodwinds. This young lady not only had these kinds of problems herself, which has driven her to this agenda. She had 2 jaw surgeries, but she also was able to rehabilitate from that and have a stellar performance career. In fact, last year she was the award winner of 2 international concerto competitions where the prize was performances at Carnegie Hall. And that's on saxophone. She also won one on flute and performed in Vienna as an international concerto competition winner. So her research showcases the potential to have transdisciplinary interactions. So when she's working with the medical experts who understand how to do EMG or looking at these facial muscle activity patterns, she's able to describe what's important to her as a musician at such a high level. And here's Dr. Surve and I with Sarah and her award. So this is sort of an indication of where the field is going. We have, for the first time, students pursuing doctorates in music that address these concerns from the musician standpoint, and hopefully conducting transformative research in collaboration with other disciplines. So backing up another couple of weeks, so so just kind of retrace what we just talked about. We're currently working with an independent school district to be the first in the state of Texas that would label and identify itself as concerned about these conditions and concerned about how to educate young students so they're better prepared for this kind of stuff. We have UNT with the first PhD program in music. We have students actively involved in contributing to our science. And now I'm going to shift to a week before that where we were in China. And here's a group at Tsinghai University. This population of students and faculty are very interested in performing arts health. China now is emerging as, I think, the 18th or 19th or 20th country to consider this as a national agenda. So we have the Performing Arts Medicine Association in America. We have similar associations in Britain, or England, in France, and Scandinavian countries. We have similar initiatives in Japan, and now we're looking to start things in China. And here we have the seminar where we're looking at possible joint research collaborations and joint training programs. And one of the things that I also want to mention as a global initiative is related to hearing loss. So as we move into a more digital age, we recognize that younger people are able to listen and consume music at unprecedented rates because every cell phone is a personal music player. Well, there is a cost to that. There is a consequence to that. And the World Health Organization recognizes that hearing loss is a global epidemic among children because of the use of personal music players. So we're trying to address these issues at a global level because these technologies and these opportunities to consume music happen globally. In fact, when I was in Geneva this past February at the World Health Organization, we launched the first ever standard for all cell phones to be able to not only identify how much noise is going into the ears, but to inform the user routinely. Here's another group. This was a fascinating set of discussions with these young Chinese collegiate students talking about performance anxiety, devastating depression due to the potential that they would not succeed. And this is one of those things in music education that we really want to address. Music should be for the benefit of life, for having more joy and happiness, not to be so much, not to have so much pressure that it becomes debilitating to a young person. And I've got this slide up here too, just to kind of move in another direction of our tree of knowledge. Here's a piece of engineering technology that fits on the end of a trumpet that was developed with funding from the Grammys a few years ago. This is the kind of research that's also necessary to be able to analyze those biomechanical factors that lead to injury. Musculoskeletal injury is mostly caused by force, repetition, and posture. And for a trumpet player or a brass player, the forces against the lips is something that we can't really observe, but we can certainly measure. And when we do, we can identify maladaptive or risk-prone types of performance practices. And through that lens, then we can start to think about how to change our pedagogy in order to develop better performance practices. And here's another one. I have this slide up here in the background. We were talking about our piano research. What we've learned in our center is that hand span is the most important factor in considering hand problems among pianists. Well, we can exercise our hand in a way that allows it to grow. If you have small hands, you have small hands, and nothing we can do about it, other than changing perhaps the way you play and maybe even more importantly, the instrument itself. In fact, yesterday I was working with a young man who's working on his master's who has a very significant physical challenge, and he's looking to be able to play piano in a way that allows him to press piano keys, but his stature just doesn't allow that to happen. So we're thinking about working with our engineering faculty to figure out a way to make that work. In piano generally, we have now adopted the idea that changing the piano keys is a solution to the huge level of problems associated with our small Asian female populations who study piano, who have very small hands. So now our university allows us to take out the keyboard of our grand piano. 10 minutes later, it's retrofitted with a smaller key set, and actually that keyboard is more like what it was when the virtuosic literature was written. So that's just another technologically oriented solution. It's also historically consistent with what piano was in the day when these challenges were put in musicians' arena, and it also reflects the changing populations of those who are actually performing at a professional level. So I want to come back to the tree of knowledge and just showcase what's been going on just slightly, where we have performing arts health sort of hoping to move into a direction that's reflected in these two charts, where you have groups of journals kind of expressing the depth of engagement as researchers and as scientists and as clinicians and as educators. On the left, we have a group of journals that focus on sports medicine, and on the right, we have sports psychology. So comparing this body of knowledge to what we have today, we can look forward to growing and enhancing what we know and be able to apply in our arenas. So I guess then we can move on to some questions.
Great, thank you for a fantastic presentation. A lot of comments, conversation in the chat box here. One wrote, as a performing artist, yes, this person has encountered performing arts issues and has had many injuries among their peers, but not in their work in the hospital. Now she's curious to find out if there are any clinicians at her institution involved in this capacity. Do you have thoughts about, you know, if someone is in an institution where there isn't performing arts medicine department, where they can find support or where they should look first?
So I think in terms of clinicians, it may not be that there is a physician necessarily who focuses on performing arts medicine, but that doesn't mean that there aren't resources available. You know, there's physical therapy, there's occupational therapy, there's several allied health professionals who could potentially be at least provide some sort of specialized care to the performing arts population. Typically, what I would suggest if you're trying to find providers in an area would be to contact the local training programs, because local training programs tend to have a pretty good finger on the pulse of who's in the area and what they do. And so, just contacting our PT school department here and then saying, hey, I have a dancer who's got an injury, the school will provide you 10 different names of PTs who are former dancers who can potentially help out with that kind of a problem. So I think reaching out to the local training programs would probably be your best first step to try to identify folks who might be able to help.
Great. More comments here. I've assisted my musician husband to deal with his medical issues or injury issues as a musician and music major at UNT. In fact, I couldn't overcome them, so I went into UNT's library science program and became a librarian instead of a professional musician.
It makes me sad, but I've met so many people who have had to leave a career either in music or dance because of an injury or some type of problem. And so, when I talk and give talks to performers about performing arts health, one of the main take-home messages that I always give when I talk to performers is that our goal is to have a performer retire on their terms, right? We want you to retire when you feel you've done what you need to do and say what you need to say in terms of your performance, not have retirement foisted upon you because of some external circumstance. And so that's what this is all about. When we talk about injury management and prevention and all of that, is allowing the performers to retire on their own terms. That's what we want.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that too. I would be less likely to consider this issue from the employment standpoint. You say retirement, it kind of implies that you're out there working full-time, and at some point you stop. Certainly, I was a full-time musician for many years, and I stopped that, but I certainly didn't stop performing professionally and or just for my own enjoyment. So I'm frustrated with the music discipline historically because it's often projected to a student that success comes with an all-in attitude. So you go to school at UNT or wherever, and the expectation is that all of your efforts, your 110%, is devoted to pursuing performance excellence. And that in itself, I think, is partly why some musicians don't find a broader fulfillment in life, because they forego taking on interests in addition to music. And vice versa, we have a lot of fields of study, especially in the STEM areas, where you have the same sort of attitude. You're going to get a computer science degree, man, you're coding all day long, and you're foregoing the opportunity to learn about the humanities and the arts and actually become a musician in addition to that. So the National Science Foundation, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they're all advocating now that Tier 1 research universities purposely try to dismantle some of that thought. It basically comes from post-World War II thinking we have to have hyper-specialization. And now they're saying, wow, a more productive engineer is one who has his toe in the arts, has familiarity with sensitive, kind of humanistic types of things. So I would just say, and I do, especially to students both in music and in STEM fields, don't think about this as a dichotomy, one or the other. It's a very special life's journey when you can have arts in your life no matter what other thing you're pursuing, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right before we started, we had a conversation. You asked me if I still played, and I did not. And you're talking about performance anxiety earlier, but I think it was probably that all-in or all-out attitude is why I stopped playing music for so long. A different sort of anxiety about the field.
Yeah. So I don't want to make this my career, so I'm just going to get out, rather than saying I can transition to a more, recreational mode or express myself in other ways. Or just even trying to reconcile it, in some way, that option exists.
Great. Another comment here. I am both a medical librarian and a musician, lucky to work at and to get my healthcare at Cleveland Clinic, where a performance medicine department has existed for many years. Other comments regarding health issues being encountered hold true: posture, hearing, joints, instrument, bacteria, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. I think this one is sort of the beginning of a question. I'm new to practicing music and could see back issues developing if proper posture isn't maintained and perhaps arthritis, hearing issues. Where is a good place to look for guidance on preventative care?
Prevention. So, I think a good place for musicians is, a good starting point is the primer that we put out, actually. So I think you put the link there, right, Brian? Mm-hmm. For the primer that we created on musician health. And it kind of gives the, there he goes. So it provides some basic information on just maintaining your, proper posture, all those things you mentioned: good hearing health, musculoskeletal health, vocal health, mental health. So that's a good starting point. And then there's other resources available. As I mentioned, the institutions that I mentioned, the Performing Arts Medicine Association, the Athletes in the Arts, these groups that have come together to try to create some resources for performers are good starting points as well.
Yeah, and I would add to that, well, first of all, Cleveland Clinic,
the original.
Yes, it had a very significant impact on the evolution of performing arts health. Those of us who've been involved with PAMA for years recognize that the two founders of the organization, often considered the grandmother and grandfather of the field, include Alice Franfenbrenner and Richard Letterman. And unfortunately, Alice passed away a few years ago, and Richard is a dear friend and a huge inspiration to me personally, and if he has any chance of hearing this, yes, I want to acknowledge that. And but he was the forefront, he was the guy at the Cleveland Clinic for years, a neurologist and MD who very much advocated early prevention if possible. And he's also a fine violinist. Anyway, so I want to acknowledge that, but also I would encourage the person who's looking to develop their performance skills in a way that's prevention-oriented, that they talk about these kinds of things with their teacher or whoever they're getting their instruction from. You want to find somebody who's not only aware of these problems, but knowledgeable about how they happen as it relates to pedagogy, and also concerned that you as an individual might have unique constraints or situations, whether it's pre-existing arthritis or small stature or something, that the pedagogy is actually compensated to accommodate those differences or those unique challenges, and not to push you down the road that would be considered a standardized approach to learning an instrument, which I think in some cases disallows for a more preventative tactic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, another question that came in a little earlier. Is there any work being done for musical theater artists who are often both singers and dancers?
Absolutely. So with that journal that we mentioned, The Medical Problems of Performing Artists, really takes research from all comers, including musical theater. And the musical theater has certainly a unique set of problems. So not only do you have to make the music in terms of singing, but you might be doing choreography at the same time. There's also the constraints of being on stage. So stage actors have problems too, in terms of set design, that you might have set injuries, fall off of a set piece. So more like industrial issues. There was just a couple months ago, there was a issue where a high school stage production, one of the risers that the students were standing on collapsed mid-performance, and about 20 of the high school students got sent to the hospital with fractures and injuries. And so, there's a whole sort of step piece that and safety or occupational safety concerns that come along with that theater production. So, yeah, absolutely. There's work being done and being published. There's maybe a little bit less in terms of published guidelines for that group. It's more extrapolation from the individual components, music and dance, and sort of having to put them together. But there is a body of knowledge that is getting built around that topic.
Yeah, and I would add to that musical theater is one of many contexts in which a musician might work. And they may not work in that context exclusively. They may have a portfolio type of career where they may do musical theater during a summer musical theater run. And other types of year, they're in recording sessions, or they're playing in the orchestra, or they're playing in different kinds of contexts. In that context specifically, though, there are some unique needs that need to be addressed, especially for the pit orchestra context. So a lot of musical theaters would have a place where the musicians would sit and try to play that may not be big enough to accommodate just a number of people. So people are a little more cramped. Sometimes they're underneath an overhang, so the loudness levels are exaggerated because of the high reverberation in those environments. Sometimes the lighting is insufficient for really seeing your music well. Sometimes the air quality isn't that, so yeah. Musical theater, whether it's for a singer or a dancer or a musician, is just one context that any one of those three groups might find themselves working in part-time or sometimes or rarely or all the time. But it does come with its unique challenges.
Yeah, so very few people are just dedicated, I'm just a pit musician and that's what I do. A lot of times it's a gig economy where I do this for a while, then I go do that, and then I do this other thing. We see that especially in the college population. Every college musician that I see, I ask them how many ensembles they're in and performing in, and the number is usually very high, 6, 7, 8 different ensembles, different groups that they're performing with. And so, that's one of our considerations, is that if I, as a physician, say, hey, you've got this injury, you need to rest and stop playing, right? I'm not just inconveniencing that musician, I'm disrupting 8 different productions that are relying on this musician to provide service for that organization.
Okay, someone typed into the chat box, International Association of Dance Medicine and Science.
Yep, IADMS. They're kind of the dance counterpart to PAM. PAM is everybody, but the dancers specifically created this group, IADMS, and they're similar in the sense that they're an international association. They have a journal. It's the Journal of Dance Medicine and Science, so it's more focused specifically on dance. But yes, that's another organization.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Do the presenters know if UNT music faculty are trained to instruct or assist their students in any of these performing arts health issues as part of their lesson time?
I'm handing that off to Kris. I'm not touching that.
Well, I guess I would respond to that question by saying that all these topics are familiar to musicians because they've experienced them their whole life, or they've had colleagues who've had experiences with these things. So it's not something that they're not aware of, but the training in music hasn't been sufficient to generate the kind of knowledge that we believe is important to generate within studio teaching faculty or conducting faculty. And I guess I would go back to Dr. Surve's analogy to sports, where we talked mostly about the allied health professions and the medical people providing services to the athletic communities. But there's also another transformation that happened in sports, which was to make sure the coach and the athletic trainer, the person who teaches the student how to do athletics, is also prepared to help prevent these kinds of things. And that's where I think the music discipline is now starting to consider, that role. So the answer is yes, some faculty are very involved and interested, and through experiences and their own self-study, very attentive to these things. I think other faculty persons on the other end of the spectrum might be less aware of the problems themselves, or probably less exposed to things that might be considered relevant to prevent. And so it's all over the map, and I would say that's probably representative of the music field generally globally, is that there are some that are highly invested in this, and then some just haven't even considered it. And of course, we have to recognize in music that we have tremendous amount of tradition that comes to the table, where, you know, somebody might be carrying on a tradition of their teacher who was carrying on a tradition of their teacher. It goes all the way back to the days of Bach. This is the way we teach. This is my pedagogical approach. And it's hard to shake them off of that tradition. There's their expertise. So that's also an issue. And then, of course, and this is back to what we're doing with the Denton ISD, is that the holy grail of all this is to have our music educators community, those people who give the instruments or set the choir up for the first time in a child's life. Here's the violin. From day one, we have a cultural sort of norm where that student is taught to appreciate what they're doing as it relates to their own personal health and well-being, just like we would with football. You know, if you're going to be on the football team, there's great care to make sure that the student appreciates the challenges associated with doing that activity. So music educators have a primary role to play in establishing that sort of mindset and attitude from day one when a child gets the instrument. And unfortunately, music education at a national level and even an international level seemingly has less engagement directly with all these issues compared to the performance faculty, who I think appreciate it more just because they are more likely to have experienced it themselves as performers and or have seen colleagues have these kinds of challenges. So yes, but there's a lot more to do.
Great. Well, thank you so much. If you have any more questions or want to see more resources, the link is up on the slide. Thank you both again for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you.